Hey there folks, my name is Markus and I am the composer for Living Dream Entertainment. This time you are joining me in my studio to study on a song Perish from the upcoming game Out of the Storm. Perish is the game over tune in the game, so we will be seeing what makes a game over tune, what kind of maybe chord progressions, structures, instrumentation, and general composition process. And we also will be looking into a little bit of studying music for this piece, some preparing work, just to give an overall view how the future lessons will be once you start really studying with me. Alright, so before actually jumping into anything, first and foremost you have to always consider what is your client wants, what is that your employer wants. And this time Dakota had some thoughts that he gave to me, that what he wanted. First of all, he told me that the instrumentation should be somewhat similar with the tune Before the Storm that I have written earlier. You can find the tune from SoundCloud, for example, or I think it was also here on the site. And another thing that he mentioned, that he described the game over scene. There was a series of photographs and journal entries that will be shown in a rapid manner upon the death of the character that eventually comes to an end and there's just a black screen. And then I asked whether he wanted more of a sad feeling or a fateful feeling to this game over tune, and he told me that he wanted more of a fateful feeling. So these are the guidelines that I have received for this particular piece, and these are then the framework within which I have to work. So we have a fateful feeling, fateful emotion, instrumentation similar to Before the Storm, so we have to review that one. And then we have a mental image of what the player will be seeing, which is images and entries from what the player so far has successfully accomplished in the game. So now the first thing that we're going to do, we're going to start preparing. So headphones on, speakers on, let's listen to some music, beginning with Before the Storm. Okay, so when listening to music in order to study for a song or a project, there are a few things that I pay attention to. First, regarding instrumentation, Dakota wanted the instruments to be similar to the instruments in Before the Storm. So what I did, I took my beautiful black moleskin notebook. It's expensive, I know, but I love them. And I just simply wrote a few things down while I had the instruments there. So that is something that you should do too when you are listening to music in preparation. Listen to the instruments first, since instruments are a huge deal when it comes to the color of the sound. The relationship between the notes is what creates the emotion and the feeling, but the instruments are what creates the color and the overall tone of the piece. Alright, so I hope you have listened to some game over tunes, for example from YouTube or Spotify, Google Play, whatever sound service you want to use. But now something to pay attention to when listening to the music that you want to analyze and maybe follow after. First, instruments that you heard. You probably heard piano, harp, glockenspiel, strings probably, depending if the tune was more faithful, there might have been some percussion and low heartbeat or something similar. So instrumentation is one to pay attention to. And then The other thing that you can pay attention to, or you should pay attention to actually, is structure. Usually game over tunes are very short, around 30 seconds to about 2 minutes if they are very long, but generally a game over tune is no longer than 30 seconds. And there are a few different structures they come in. There's one that is actually my personal favorite. There is 3 parts, A, B, and C, or I guess I could name impact, theme, and tail. The first impact is the introduction of the song. The very first few beats may be a crescendo to a sharp staccato, a strike or a stab, or just a rising melody, or whatever you come up with, something that introduces the subject of death and failure. And then there is a theme part that is usually repeated once or twice. More than that might be too much. And that is like the main meat of the actual game over tune. And then comes a tail that then repeats to the end and eventually just fades away. Or optionally, there is a some decorative ornament in the end that closes the tune. Then there are other structures, just a simple A-B with the theme and the tail, or just an impact and tail. So there are many variations of this. There is even just a simple one theme that is played once and then it ends, and then in the end it's just silence. But this is something to pay attention to. What is the structure of these tunes? And is there something that you could possibly follow after? Now, Perish, I decided to compose following the pattern of impact, theme, and tail. For me, it makes most sense. It is very fun to make, and there is actually a lot you can do. You can do a lot with the others too, but this one gives most variation and action in this short piece. Here you see my Pro Tools session of the piece Perish. On the left you see the list of tracks, and then following right in the middle, the bigger screen, you see all the clips and the actual music. I won't be focusing so much on the actual mixing and setup part. I will just go through it briefly so you get the idea of what is happening here. If you want to, you can stop the screen at each point and take notes of how I have set up my plugins. I will explain everything very briefly. When I start the session, the very first tracks that I ever put in are the click track, the master track, a pre-master track, and reverb track. The click track is there for all live playing, and I have it always as the first track. Then I have a master track. I usually have nothing there. It's just where everything just finally goes. Then I have a pre-master track. It's in essence a auxiliary track with a channel strip and a trim plugin. Then a reverb as an auxiliary track. Focusing on the pre-master auxiliary track, I have the empty channel strip. It has not been used here, but I sometimes use it for kind of pre-mastering EQ, or when I start a mixing process, I might do some minor touches to get the overall tone to start up with. But what you're seeing here now is a trim plugin. I use a trim plugin to increase the overall volume of the tracks in the recording and programming part. That forces me then to pull down the volume faders of the tracks which gives me more headroom in the mixing part to play with the volume. So it's a very handy trick. In this, now you see it's on it's pi-bassed because, well, it's not needed since everything is mixed and finalized. So then I just pi-bass it in the end. Then, in order to get everything directed to the pre-master before going into the actual master track, I have set up the input for the pre-master as bus 7 and 8. And then I route all my tracks to bus 7 and 8 as their output. And then the output of pre-master goes to the master, the out 1 and 2. The reason why I have a pre-master track is mainly just a psychological thing to separate the master from, well, the pre-master. I might do processing on the pre-master track, since there you can still play with sends if you want to, for some weird reason, to add effects to your overall, the whole thing. But I rarely, if ever, do that. But then later in the actual mastering phase, if I want to, I can just then go to straight to the master track, or just open up the final rendered product as a completely new file, whichever I want. But this is mainly just a psychological thing, to have everything separated from the master track. Here is my reverb plugin in the reverb auxiliary track. I use Space. It's a stock convolution reverb that comes with Pro Tools. It's pretty handy. It has modeled, in this case, a church. I assume it's in Germany. No, I would not bet my life on that, but that is just an assumption. For this song I wanted a bit longer reverb, so that's why I didn't go for a hall or room or chamber. And there is two versions of this. As you can see, I have chosen the 1M. There's also the 2M. The 1M just sounded better, so that's why I chose it. As you can see, I have the wet as 0, and then the dry channel just completely killed. And that is the reason why, is that in this track I want only and only the reverb signal. I don't want any of the actual dry signal from the tracks. That gives me a possibility of playing with illusion of distance without being very resource heavy for the processor, since reverb in a sense is a mathematical effect, so it is a very processor heavy plugin. Having just one reverb plugin in an auxiliary track, it's a lot lighter for your computer than having a separate reverb for every single track. And then to have my tracks sent to the reverb track, I have created a bus for it. I always select bus 1 and 2 for the reverb input, and then, as you remember, 7 and 8 for the pre-master. 1 and 2, it just makes sense to me. So, but you, for yourself, whatever you choose, keep it organized, keep it clean, whatever makes sense to you and is best for you. It doesn't really matter which of all the buses you choose. I prefer 1 and 2. Then, before continuing with the tracks of the rest of the piece, I want to just quickly go through visually how I have the different parts of the piece. There is the impact, and then there is the theme, and then there is the tail. Now, focusing on the impact part, I have these 4 tracks here: Heart, Wind, Then I have an audio track with an explosion, the grenade loop from soundbible.com. It is actually a very good site. You find all kinds of good stuff there for different kinds of licenses. And then I have two drum tracks. I have a big drum, it's a bass drum, and then thunder drums that you probably know with the name taiko. Here is how the actual impact sounds by itself. So what you hear is an impact and then a wind rising and then eventually just fading away. For the hard wind and all the other sounds, except for the explosion, I have used sounds from Expand 2, that is a stock virtual instrument that comes with Pro Tools. I chose the sound Heavy Wind from the section Ambience and Effects. Here on the screen you can see my settings for it. A bit longer attack, even longer release. The bass level is all the way up so that I can have this deep rumble there. And then cut off, I've pulled a lot of the high frequencies off, so I have the very heavy focus on the lower rumble of the wind. And then I added a EQ here. I went a bit crazy. I never do this with actual instruments. This is only for sound design purposes. You see I have cut a lot of the high frequencies off, and then I have two ginormous boosts and also low cuts to contain the low frequencies. This gave me I found these nice two spots where I have a lot of the low rumble of the wind enhanced, and then there was this very nice the low mid frequency around 240 that I just liked a lot of the harder sound that it brought to the wind. But here is how the track sound, the hard wind, sounds just by itself. And then here is how it sounds with the EQ. And then here you see the explosion of the impact. As you can see again, I have gone a bit crazy on the EQ. I have some boosts, one around 850, and then again a bit over 200, and then a boost around 70. Yes, 70. And then I have just scooped out again the high frequencies to make the explosion sound a little bit more lower. Then I added a compression. This is in a sense supposed to resemble a guitar compressor, so it has just two simple main controls: sustain and level. And here you can see the settings I found. I was just goofing around trying to find out a place where I was comfortable with the sound of the actual explosion. And then I heard in my headphones that this still needed some reverb to have some space for the explosion. So I added a reverb. Also, all of these are stock plugins straight from Pro Tools. I wanted an ambient reverb. I chose a large space, and then I found a good wet balance around 34, well, exactly 34. It sounded good to me. What it exactly is around 35, 36, 33, it doesn't really matter. Around there was what I then in the end chose. And then you can see that the diffusion is all the way up to 100. I wanted this very ambient, softer reverb that would accompany then the explosion. Here is how the explosion sounds without any of the plugins. Here is how it sounds with the EQ, and then with the compression, and finally with the reverb. And then the drums of the impact. This big drum, it is also, as I said, everything from expand, big, hard from the percussion section. And you see the settings, I have delayed the attack a little bit and adjusted the starting time of the sample. I have also made a ginormous cutoff from the high frequencies. I don't know exactly where the cutoff numerically is, but that's where the sound was comfortable, and that's the most important thing. It's not about the numbers, it's about how it sounds. And then these are now the first instruments where you can see my reverb send. So all the rest of my instruments I have sent to the reverb track. And so what you see right there in the middle, the volume fader is in essence the amount or the volume of the track that I am sending to the reverb auxiliary. And the more volume I add to this reverb send, the more reverb the actual track will have, which then will give an illusion of space and distance. So balancing between the track's own volume and then the volume of this send, I can place the drum in depth in the sound image. And then you see, if you go a little bit higher in the middle, you see 3 buttons: save, pre, and FMP. I have chosen pre and FMP. The pre means that the reverb send is before the actual. The pre means is that the reverb is before the actual volume fader of the track. So it's in a sense a full volume copy that is sent to this track, and then it's going to be changed by the effect on the reverb send. And then the FMP is it is for the now I don't remember exactly what it stands for, but it basically connects the panning of the send with the panning of the track. So whatever is the panning of the track, that is also the panning of the send. And this then limits the panoramic image and width of the actual reverb. So online composer acquaintance of mine once said that a reverb can sometimes ruin even the most carefully designed panning of or the stereo image of the track. So I always have the reverb panning connected with the actual track, so I don't have a full stereo reverb, and that will then destroy the stereo image of the piece. And musically, it's just one hit. In Expand gives me 12 different sounds of the same drum hit in different places and different spots in a sense. I found one that sounded good, and that's what I used all the way through the piece actually. And then here you will see the settings for the thunder drum. Again, you see my reverb send, pre and FMP, and then the amount of signal that I'm actually sending to the track to have a good place in space. And then you see my settings for the drum. Here I have a very soft, also a very soft sound. I have cut off a lot of the high frequencies. I have changed the pitch a bit, and then I put the attack to be actually very fast, to compensate the slow attack of the big drum. So in a sense I combined two drums into one. That's how it sounds. That was my aim, but it's still two separate instruments. I could have done this with actually just one instance of expand. You see there is A, B, C and D slots, but this is again just a mental thing. I want to have every instrument as a separate track to then have more control in the actual mixer of Pro Tools. So I don't need to always go to the virtual instrument to tune things, so that then I can just do everything in the mixer, so I don't need to jump back and forth. It makes my life a lot easier. And then here is how the big drum sounds by itself. And then here is the thunder drum, how it sounds by itself. And then one more time, here is how the actual impact sounds separated from the rest of the music. And then here is the theme. I have actually just a harp playing an arpeggio and then a descending melody, and it is built around H minor chord, and you can see the notes that I have played. Coming down, the melody has been H, A, G, then coming down to D, C, D, and then a H. So it's a very tonic. It evolves only around the non-dissonant notes of H minor, only the notes that sound actually really good with it. I didn't want to have too much fear and dissonance in this. I played around with a few melodies. I always experiment with melodies before really playing something in. Here this was what I found to be very nice. I played it in. I haven't done any quantizing here. It's just straight up how I played it. Whereas, for example, with the drums, the piano, and the glockenspiel that we'll jump into a bit later, there I have used some quantizing to have a bit tighter performance. Whereas this harp and the strings below, I haven't used any quantizing at all to have the natural human performance. But here, as you can see again, the settings for the harp. Harp is just as it comes straight. I haven't done any changes to it besides adding a bit reverb and some format control, if I remember right. It was a couple of days ago when I wrote this, and I have forgotten already what I exactly did to it. But it's pretty much exactly as it comes when you choose harp from the string section of the plugin of the virtual instrument. And then there you see that I have pretty much unity gain for the harp send. So I have a lot of reverb there. Oh yes, and here is how the theme sounds it just by itself. And then finally now we come to the actual tail part that then is the conclusion of this. So let's dive into the instruments first one by one, and at the same time we go through the notes again like we have done so far. Let's start with the drums. As you can see, the pattern is the same throughout the piece. When I started writing the piece, first I had a very varying and more complex. So big drum and the thunder drums, they play exactly at the same time. But what I had before was more uneven. It was still on one of the 4 beats of the bar, but the actual strikes of the drums, it jumped from place to place to create a feeling of uneasiness and basically an uneven, unsettling emotion to it. But then after I had added all the other instruments, most of them, it didn't fit anymore. It didn't sound good. So then when in the end I was writing the ending, I wrote a very familiar, much used pattern that sounds like this. I decided to, that this is a lot better, and it actually sounds a lot better with everything else. So then I just made that be the actual thing all throughout. So first I just played it in, everything I just played it in, and then I actually then, yes, I used quantization here. Until now I have preferred my drums tight. So I usually don't control the velocity unless there is like huge jumps that just sound bad. For the quantization with drums, I always have with the drums about 3% of randomness. So there is very subtle amount of human touch to it. So it's not exactly on the beat all the time. And that is 3% of an eighth note. So it's some milliseconds of variation. I have sometimes experimented with more, but up until now, I might change my mind in the future. But for now, I have stick to 3%. It gives me still a tight, but a little bit more human performance. Then we have the Glockenspiel. So this one, I returned to the original before the storm session, and I exported a MIDI file of the Glockenspiel there. Then I brought it in here, and I already by that time I had already actually a 3-chord progression with the lower strings that ended with a H minor, and then so there was a conflict of key, so I took down the melody with the Glockenspiel, and then later I actually ended up ditching the lower strings chord progression. I didn't like it. It didn't make sense in the end. So this stayed, and then stayed to control the rest of the instruments actually with the piano. But here, as you can, if you compare later, you can hear the pattern that is pretty much the same with a slight variation. First of all, the first of the 4 notes has been dropped. It's not there anymore. The last of the 4 notes has been taken half a step back, and then the whole pattern has actually been moved half a step forward. So in this current pattern, the first two notes are on the offbeats of second and third, and then the fourth note then lands on the fourth beat. It gives a nice movement, nice sense of motion to the piece. And this is how the glockenspiel loop that is repeated twice in the tail. This is how it sounds in its entirety. And then looking into the settings, you see them here. Glockenspiel. I have actually here modified it a bit. I added 50% chorus actually here. I delayed the attack. I made a long release time. I have the full frequency spectrum of the notes. I added formant control a bit. I don't remember if I tuned the more attack knob. Most likely did not, but I might remember wrong. But then if you look to the lower part of the instrument, you see two effect slots. I added a lot of echo and delay here. I have a gallop echo, you see the settings there, and chaos delay with the size feedback settings. In a sense, experimenting with these effects, it comes down to what really sounds good and what enhances the emotion you want to bring. In this piece, we wanted to emphasize the faithfulness, so the drums being the stagnant beat of fate in the background, then the delay and echo here, it just sounded really nice, so I had it there. Here you can see the piano of the piece. It's also an 8-bar loop repeated twice. It's all built around two chords. There is an H minor, and then that is played twice, an arpeggio, a slow arpeggio just going up, all eighth notes of 1 bar, and then there is a very scale-like arpeggio built around an A minor chord. And this was actually just a result of experimenting and improvisation, and it just sounded good. I tried using a regular A minor chord, but it didn't sound equally as good as this scale-like variation. And here is how it looks in its entirety, how it sounds in its entirety, this first repetition of the loop. For those curious minds, the notes that I have modified here in the piano part, the notes that go along with the A minor scale, there is B, and then there is a C. So far I have used the note H. it is actually the German equivalent for B, just so you don't get lost if I ever say H again. It is also used here in the Nordic countries. Mostly I use B, but for some reason now I have by accident said H. Sorry for that. And here you see the piano as an instrument. I have changed nothing, it's just straight how it comes from expand, and then right next to it you see the reverb send. It's a very conservative amount of reverb. It gives a nice feeling of space and distance, but it is not too much. Since the resonant ambience, it already in itself, it has a good amount of space as a sound. Right, and then moving on, we have the harp. This is again just without quantization, just straight how I played it. This is actually more improvisation. The harp was the instrument that I played in last in this tail part, just because it has more of a role of a spice rather than a leading instrument. Here the chords, they are built around again B minor and A minor. They take turns throughout the piece, and so the lower three notes there you see, they are on even space. It's always a power chord, so an B octave with an F sharp there in between, or an A octave with an E there in between. And then all the notes above it, it's basically an improvised emotion as I was inspired to play when I listened to this through. I did experiment and practice a bit, but the actual moment of recording, it was a surprise that what in the end came out of it. And now actually with this one, the harp, I want to show you the piano roll of the thing. You see the velocity goes a little bit pretty crazy. You can see it both in the lower part of the screen and also the intensity of the color red. But here you can also see the actual notes that I have played. And here is how the harp part actually sounds isolated by itself. And then the last instruments, we have strings. Normally I would have every string section separately, the first violins, second violins, violas, cellos and basses. But for this context, I felt that it would be better to have just high strings and then low strings or bass strings, as I have named here. Visually you see that the high strings, they make a small dip in the beginning and then they just go higher, higher and higher. And then the low strings, they take a step up and then they just go down, 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 down. And then they return up in the very end. When writing for two sounds, bass and tenor, or well, bass and treble, rarely if ever, well, I really can't say that, you can move the sound, both sounds, up the same distance and then down the same distance as you move forward from chord to chord, but that most often does not sound good. It is better to have opposite movement than movement to same direction. Movement to same direction works when the amount of movement is not the same. Though at those times it works most often. But the best thing you can do is to have when the treble is going up, have the bass going down, and vice versa. That gives the best sound and feeling of emotion and feeling of motion, and it just sounds best. I have experimented this, experienced this a few times, both by accident and on purpose. So whenever you write for treble and bass, have the movement go to opposite directions. And then there is not much to see here. Again, high strings, you see the reverb and the instrument. I haven't changed too much. Mostly I just focused on the attack and release times. I wanted the feeling of a rising wave that then just disappears eventually, and then another and disappears, another comes. So I was just adjusting the attack and release times until I was comfortable with them. And then the same thing with the low strings. You see the attack and release being rather long. I was just finding where the sound was the best to my ears. And then moving on, I actually want to show you the piano roll of the strings that you can see right here. You can now see the notes here, and this is how it actually sounds isolated by itself. Alright, so there was, in a sense, the puzzle pieces and what is happening in this piece. One last thing, in this picture you see the fades in the end, you see the lines below the clips. In the end, I faded away the actual volume of the track, and since the reverb signal is completely independent, I just faded that out a bit later to create a nice fade out for the piece into the black silence of death. And here is now a bit of it how everything just sounds together. It has come time to conclude this behind the scenes tutorial show around whatever you want to call it. Now, a few things for you to really remember, and I hope that you took notes and that will tag along to your mind from this. First of all, the form of a game over tune. Here I used a sharp impact and then a very short theme and then a long tail. The impacts, it can be a rise to an impact and then have a bit longer theme and then a shorter tail, any variation there. And as in the beginning I mentioned, it can be just a theme and a tail, impact and a tail, or just a theme that is repeated. So there are many variations to this, and don't be afraid to experiment. In order to create a feeling of faithfulness with drums, it is better to stick with a simple pattern that is then repeated, rather than have something complicated and extravagant. For the tail part, it's better to have something simple when it comes to a game over tune. Game over is something that you don't actually really stay and listen to, so to save your resources, you don't need to create something extravagant unless it's explicitly desired and wanted. The matter of death is usually simple, so to me it makes most sense to have simple music. And as said in the tail, the repeat can happen as many times as you want. It can be programmed to loop in some game programs as if you want to, or it can be just one long piece that eventually just fades away. There are many possibilities for that. And when it comes to quantization, I prefer so far I have preferred very strict quantization with drums. I have a feeling that I will loosen up a bit on that one in my future productions, but for this one I will have it tight and clean like this. But for strings, especially when it's long strings, lush strings, never quantize. Have it as a human performance as you played it in. And also never be afraid to just improvise a part. My harp part was completely improvised, and in all honesty the strings part, it was very much improvised too, and it sounded very, very good. And then regarding the string part, opposite movement, the opposite directions make a full nice sound. So that was it. Thank you very much. Alright then, that was it for this time. I hope you learned, I hope you enjoyed, I hope you took notes, so that you can continue to work on these techniques, review and study more. I want to thank you on behalf of the team that you took time to watch this lesson, this tutorial, and I want to thank you so much for your support. It means a whole lot to us. Again, my name is Markus Lappalainen, and I'm the composer for Living Dream Entertainment. Here you have one more time, Perish. See you next time.